Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to your Nan McKay and Associates Housing Help Session. Today's topic is the Streamlining Final Rule, and I'm Annie Stevenson. Now, we're using a large conference room for this session, and as a result, you're not all being muted as you come into the room. In fact, I can hear, I've been listening for a few minutes, I can hear you guys talking. So we are muting you manually, but meanwhile, in order to cut down on the background noise, let me please have you mute your own phone. Like right now I hear a phone ringing. Because if I can hear you, everybody else can hear you. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. This is not anything you're doing. It's the audio program that we're using. Now you're being muted, and at the end of the session there's going to be 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A. And at that time, if you want to ask a question, please press *7 on your phone, and that will raise your hand. I'll unmute you to ask your question. If you have your hand up and somebody else asks your question before I call on you, then you can press *9 to put your hand back down. So once again, there will be a 20-minute Q&A at the end of my presentation. If you want to ask a question at that time, please press *7. Now, you should be seeing my slide that says Housing Help Session Streamlining Final Rule. If you need the handout was attached to your email invitation, and it's also available on the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. There is a PDF symbol, and then it says 323 HHS Streamlining Final Rule. That is your handout, which is simply a picture of the slides that I'm going to show you. Once again, please mute your own phone because we are able to hear you. We're trying to mute you manually, but meanwhile, please mute your phone. Okay. So today we're going to talk about, of course, the Streamlining Final Rule. We're going to talk about the portions of that rule that has already been implemented, some temporary compliance options that were available until 2015 that are included in this rule. Please mute your phone because we can all hear you. It's okay. It's not you. Normally you'd be automatically muted coming into the room, but because we had to use a huge conference room for everybody to be here, it's not muting you automatically. We're also going to talk about which of the streamlining measures are mandatory and which are optional, and the effective dates for different parts of the rule. So let's dive right into it. The Streamlining Rule was published March 8th, and I've given you a link to that on slide number 3. And I strongly recommend that you click on that link, download a copy of the rule to your computer. You don't necessarily have to print it out, and read through the entire rule. It's 25 pages in the PDF version. We won't have time today to talk about everything that's in the rule, and especially in parts of it, HUD explains their reasoning behind certain decisions that they've made. So the final rule combines Appropriations Act changes from 2014 and 2015. It includes 3 of the 4 temporary compliance options that we're going to talk about in a minute. It includes the streamlining rule for the public housing grievance process, and that proposed rule was published back in 2008, so that one's been waiting a long time. and it includes other streamlining measures that were included in the proposed rule that was published back in January of 2015. And the purpose of all of these streamlining measures, of course, is to reduce administrative burden, to help your program run more efficiently and hopefully more cost effectively. Now, most of the provisions of the final rule are effective April 7th, but there's a longer timeline for the changes to the earned income disallowance, and I'm going to discuss that. And of course, some of the changes are already in effect. So there's some good news here. Many of the changes are either already in effect or they're optional. And more good news, for optional changes, the effective date doesn't really apply. So, for example, the effective date of the final rule is April 7th, but if you were going to adopt an optional policy like accepting family self-certification of assets, then that starts whenever you say it starts. It's not mandatory, so it doesn't have a mandatory effective date. HUD sent an email to executive directors on the same day that the rule was published, and they said in that rule that they're going to issue supplemental guidance in the near future. And I imagine that would be something like a PIH notice. Hopefully they'll explain a few of the things that we have questions on. You'll see as we go through the material, there are a couple of things that we're not sure exactly how that's going to work. So let's start out by talking about the previously implemented changes under the 2014 and 2015 Appropriations Acts. These are changes that Congress made to some of the rules that were included in with the funding bills for those 2 years. The ones that have already been implemented were not changed in the final rule. You don't have to do anything differently. And what HUD is doing with this rule is formalizing the changes to the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFRs, that correspond to these changes. So under the 2014 Appropriations Act, we had several changes that were effective July 1st of 2014. The definition of extremely low income was changed to go up to the federal poverty level, and HUD's PDNR, HUDuser.org, they updated their income limit charts to reflect that, so you didn't really have to do anything. We had a utility rule change for the voucher program, where you now are required to use the utility allowance for the lower of the actual bedroom size of the unit or the voucher bedroom size. And that was also effective back in July of 2014. So the only thing that happened with this rule was that the corresponding CFR, which happens to be 982.517, was changed to match this Appropriations Act rule change. And if you need additional information about any of these changes, you can refer to the Federal Register notice that was published on June 25th of 2014. Now, 2014 appropriations also included the option for biennial inspections for the voucher program. And so you may already be doing that. You may have decided not to do that, or you may want to do it now. Or you may want to continue inspecting every unit annually. That's also a valid option. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the material. In 2014, Congress also changed the public housing flat rent rule. And then in the 2015 Appropriations Act, they implemented additional changes to that. Those changes were effective in October of 2015, And you can refer to the Federal Register notice of September 8th, 2015 for more information. The change in the 2015 appropriations was they gave housing authorities a little more flexibility in that they gave you the option of using 80% of regular fair market rent, FMR, or 80% of small area FMR, or 80% of unadjusted rents in non-metropolitan areas. And this rule also changed the rule on phasing in flat rent increases, saying that you can no longer partially phase in, you have to phase in 35% per year. You could not phase in, let's say, 15% one year and 20% the next. So I'm not going to go through the all of the flat rent rule during this session, but you can refer back to that notice if you need more info. In addition to the Appropriations Act changes from the last 2 years, HUD finalized 3 of the 4 temporary compliance options that were available to PHAs from 2013 to 2015. Now, these were all optional, and for agencies that had implemented one or more, HUD said those agencies could continue to implement those changes after they expired in 2015. The Housing Authority just had to fill out a waiver form that was attached to the notice. So your agency may be implementing one or more of these now. Now, there were 4 temporary compliance options. Only 3 of them were finalized. And for one of them, they made some major changes at the final rule stage. And I'm going to discuss all of those. So the ones that were finalized were the option for streamlined annual re-exams. This is the one that had changes. It's really not a streamlined annual re-exam. It's streamlined documentation for fixed income, and I'll explain what the notice says about that. The option for accepting family self-certification of assets when the total assets for the family are $5,000 or less, and an option to approve in-house exception payment standards up to 120% of fair market rent as a reasonable accommodation. I'm going to talk about all 3 of those a little bit later. Now, there were 4 temporary compliance options, and one of them was an option for using prior year income instead of anticipating future income, and this one was not implemented in the final rule. If you're using that, you need to stop and go back to anticipating income for the 12 months following admission to the program or re-exam. The reason they took that off the table was the version that came out was overly complex. It was kind of more trouble than it was worth, so they just canceled that in the final rule. Next, we're going to talk about the changes that impact both public housing and the voucher program, and afterward we'll talk about the changes that only impact one or the other. The first change was a change in the regulations governing documentation and disclosure of Social Security numbers. As you know, these regulations changed in 2010, and currently applicants must document the social for every household member except non-contending, which means ineligible non-citizens. And of course, they can stay on the waiting list while you're waiting for those documents to come in. There's an exception now to the rule saying that must be provided before the family comes on the program. So here's the other change they made. If an applicant family pulled from the wait list has a child under 6 that joined the household within the last 6 months, and they don't have a social, then the family can come on the program and they have 90 days to provide the Social Security number for that child. Now, there's a little wrinkle here in what they mean by within the last 6 months. For the voucher program, it's within 6 months prior to the date of voucher issuance. And for public housing, that is the date of admission, is the effective date of the public housing lease. So for the voucher program, if they have added a child within 6 months prior to the voucher issuance date, and that child does not have a social, then the family can come on the program and they have 90 days from the effective date of the initial HAP contract to provide. So they're using 2 different dates there, just for the voucher program. Now, you could, or you must actually, grant the family an additional 90 days if they have not provided the documentation due to circumstances beyond their control. And an example of that is, in some parts of the country, it takes more than 90 days to get a Social Security number for a child. So, in those cases, of course, you're going to be giving them the extension. But if the Social Security number documentation has not been provided within the required time frames, then you must terminate the family. Now, this change is mandatory. And what they did was make this similar to the existing rule for participants and residents that are already on the program. So the current rule is, if a family that's already on the program adds a child under 6 that does not have a social, we add that child to the assisted family and give the family 90 days to provide. Typically, this would apply to a newborn. Housing authorities no longer have the option of waiting for the social to come in to add the baby. In fact, we haven't had that option since 2010. So with this change, they extended this same time frame to applicants on the waiting list that already existed for participants in the voucher program and public housing residents. As I said, this is mandatory. Now, many of these changes are going to require changes to your administrative plan. In public housing, your admissions and continued occupancy policies, your ACOP, and they may or may not require revisions to your annual plan. That depends on whether you determine that any of these constitute a significant amendment to your annual plan. Okay. The next option, they're still calling it Streamlined Annual Reexams, but all it streamlines is the verification process for fixed income sources. This is an optional policy. You don't have to do it. You may streamline this part of the annual reexam process if you choose. Now, before I get into this, we're getting a lot of emails and calls over here at Nan McKay and Associates from people asking, well, what about the triennial reexams? Congress passed a law in December that's actually a transportation bill called the FAST Act, where they did authorize triennial reexams. I don't know why it was in the Highway Department bill, but it was. However, that has not been implemented yet. In the Streamlining Final Rule, HUD addresses it, and they say that they're going to go through rulemaking and act on that separately. So we're going to see, I would imagine, a proposed rule coming out on the FAST Act that will eventually authorize triennial re-exams, but they are not authorized now. So let's talk about the change that is authorized, the streamlined verification of fixed income sources. This changed from the temporary compliance options and the proposed rule. So if you have implemented this, you're going to need to make some big changes in the way you're doing it. And here's the option. At the time a family comes on the program, you must third-party verify all income, or of course, if you can't obtain third-party, you must document why it was not available. And you may adopt a policy saying for fixed income sources, you will only fully verify once every 3 years. So you have to verify it coming on the program, and if you adopt this policy, you would then get third-party verification for fixed income once every 3 years. Now, this doesn't require that the family have only fixed sources of income. This could apply even if the family has other sources that are not fixed. So, for example, let's say you have a family where the head of the household is working and the spouse is on Social Security. You could apply the streamlined verification to Social Security. Well, you would have to fully verify the earned income every year. People have pointed out that if you go on an every 3-year schedule, then you have to be tracking, well, when is it the 3rd year? And you might have some type of little chart. Excuse me, hang on just a moment. If you use an annual re-exam checklist now, you could add something to that to remind you, well, what year do we have to third-party verify the fixed income sources again? So what do they mean by fixed income? They go into a lot of detail describing it. I'm pretty sure you already know what fixed income means. Periodic payments. Of course, things like Social Security, SSI, pensions, whether they're public or private pensions, annuities, disability or death benefits that are paid periodically, or really any source of income that's subject to a cost of living adjustment, a COLA, or a rate of interest. So when we say we're going to streamline the verification process, it means that for fixed income, you could simply apply the published COLA to the previously verified amount. Now, as you know, Social Security publicizes their COLA. Other pension programs often will post the COLA on their website, or in some cases the client may be able to bring you documentation of the COLA for that year. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have Mr. Smith on your caseload, and he receives a pension from the teachers union. And he comes in for his annual re-exam, and his most recent award letter is 10 months old. Well, under the old rules, we would need to ask Mr. Smith to contact the teachers union and somehow get them to send him a current document, a document less than 60 days old probably under your policies for how old those verifications can be. But if you adopt this policy, then you could go to the teachers union website, look and see if they posted the amount of the cost of living adjustment, and apply that to the previously verified amount. So that could be a pretty good time saver. Now remember, you have to third-party verify at admission and at least every third year after that. And if you can't get information about the COLA for a fixed source of income, then of course you would have to third-party verify as well. And remember, this is optional. You may decide you want to continue requiring third-party verification at every re-exam, and that would be fine. Be fine with HUD. Next subject I want to talk about is the Earned Income Disallowance, the EID. And HUD made 2 changes to that. First of all, there's a reduced time frame for clients to benefit from the EID. That's mandatory. Second change is you can now decide what percentage of the increase in earned income you're going to exclude in year 2. However, HUD realized that implementing these 2 changes immediately could present a disadvantage for clients who are already getting the EID. And so they grandfathered in those clients. The new calculation and tracking method will apply to clients who qualify for the EID on or after May 9th of 2016. For everybody that's getting it now, or everybody that qualifies up to and including May 8th, the old rules will still apply. And since a client could have up to 48 months under the old rule to utilize the 2 12-month exclusion period, you could have clients under 2 different calculation and tracking methods into 2020. You might not, but you could. The old rules, the old EID rules, are still going to apply to everyone that has qualified now and has not used up their entitlement, and to everyone that qualifies up to and including May 8th. And then starting May 9th, the new rules will apply. So the first change is the time frame for benefiting from the EID is changed to 24 consecutive months. So there's no more tracking. No more tracking of breaks in employment and interruptions in the qualification. No more having to go back and retroactively track for changes that were not reported to you. It is a 2 consecutive year qualification period. So if a client qualifies, works 2 months, loses their job, and doesn't work again in the remaining 22 of the 24 months, then they've lost it. So we no longer interrupt the EID exclusion periods and start them up again when someone, well, we could start them up again, but only if they get another job within the 24-month period. So the potential time to use the 2 exclusion periods has changed from 48 months to 24 months. So that's a good thing. The second change is that in year 2, you must exclude at least 50% of the increase in annual income due to increased earnings. But you could exclude more than 50% if you wanted to. In fact, you could exclude 100% of the increase for 2 full years. And I certainly recommend that because it saves you the trouble of recalculating every time there's a change during year 2. So you could elect to exclude 100% of the increase due to earnings in both years, Or you could continue to exclude 50% in year 2 the way we do now. I'm not sure why you would want to, because it's rather difficult, but you could. Or you could pick another percentage as long as it's at least 50%. You could say 60% or 75% or anything from 50 to 100%. So this is the part for which you need a policy. You didn't need one before because you didn't have an option. You had to exclude 50% of the increase in year 2. But now you need some language in your ACOP and your admin plan saying what percent will be excluded in year 2. So these are both positive. This should help, especially in the public housing program, because as you know, in public housing, any adult can potentially qualify. So you guys see that all the time, where in the voucher program, only family members who are disabled can qualify, so they work with it a lot less often. All right, the next change is the option to accept family self-certification of assets as long as the family's total assets are $5,000 or less. Now this is optional. You don't have to adopt this. You can continue to third-party verify assets at every re-exam. So HUD talks about their reasoning they did in the proposed rule. And the fact is that all the assets owned by all the families on your program have essentially no impact on your overall budget. Few clients have substantial assets, and for the ones that do, because of the way we calculate rent, it has often does not have a huge impact on the amount of rent that the family pays. So the impact of asset income is negligible. However, the verification process is extremely burdensome and leads to audit findings and errors. So think about it for a minute. We're talking about eliminating, at least, except for every 3 years, the process of reviewing multiple checking account statements for low balance accounts that the family uses to pay their monthly bills and which earn no interest. Those accounts have no impact whatsoever on the family's rent burden. And I know many of you want to look at more than one statement per year, correct? You may be asking for 6 of those statements that have no impact, or 3. Many of you ask for 1 now, which I think is much more efficient. But how much administrative time, how many staff hours are expended in that process? And I remember from when I was doing it, it's a lot. So remember, optional changes don't have a mandatory effective date. So you have time to get input from your staff, possibly from your board, your resident board, on how you want to go with this. Now, HUD made this similar to the option for streamlining verification of fixed income. So the rule is you must third-party verify all assets at admission. And after that, for families whose assets do not exceed $5,000, you can accept family self-certification, and you must obtain third-party verification again every 3 years. So it's similar to that streamlining of fixed income documentation. Still have to third-party verify at admission and at least every 3 years thereafter, and in the years in between, you may adopt a policy stating you'll accept family self-certification. Now, that family self-certification can be part of your annual re-exam form that you already have. And typically when family members sign that form, they say, I certify that this is true and correct. You need their certification of how much income will be produced by that asset over the next year. And we may have to assist with this, correct? So for that low balance checking account that doesn't earn income or interest, that's easy. They expect to receive zero. But let's say they have a savings account with $400 and the bank is paying 1%, then you would have to, you might have to help them figure out that 1% of $400 is $4 and have them certify that that would be the anticipated income. Once again, that's the type of interest earning asset that will have no impact on the family's rent burden. Now, you would still have to add that $4. It would have to be, the savings account would have to be listed on the 50058, and the $4 would be in column 6E, anticipated asset income, and it would be added to whatever other income the family has coming in. If you have already implemented this as a temporary compliance option, look at the current requirements to make sure that your policy is in agreement with those. They made a couple of minor changes here. The next option for both programs is an option to pay utility reimbursements quarterly instead of monthly in certain situations. Utility reimbursement payments, we call those ERPs. Now, in this rule, HUD has given you the option of sending an ERP quarterly as long as the quarterly total is $45 or less. So that means no more than $15 per month. You cannot pay less frequently than once per quarter, once per calendar quarter. Of course, you don't have to do this. You can continue to pay monthly. So think about this. This is designed to save you money on writing and mailing checks. How much would this save you? How many ERPs do you have that are $15 a month or less? Most of the ones I see are more than that. So think about whether this is going to save you time or money, or both. Especially in view of the fact that HUD said, well, if you go to quarterly reimbursement, then you have to give families an option to receive a monthly payment if quarterly pay would be a hardship. That means you would have to come up with hardship policies in your admin plan and your ACOP. For public housing, this would be the third type of different hardship policy that you would have to have. You have to have minimum rent hardship, hardship for changing from flat rent to income-based between annuals, and now a hardship for receiving an ERP monthly instead of quarterly. So I'm not sure how much real efficiency that presents, given the fact that you would have to adopt hardship policies. Also, HUD makes a point in this rule saying if the reimbursement is paid on a debit card, you have to make sure the family's not charged fees. Now, I did a little bit of research on this, and I could not find any banks that charge a fee for depositing money on a debit card. So, for example, Social Security now only pays electronically, and for clients that don't have an account, they put it on a debit card. They don't charge the Social Security beneficiary for SSA loading up that debit card. So hopefully HUD will issue some clarification on that. But the existing rule, of course, is the family can't be charged a fee. You have the, whoops, I skipped a slide, sorry. Now, if you go to quarterly payment, you're going to have to balance that out. If there's a change, the family moves out, or they transfer, then you have to reconcile that shortly after the termination of the HAP contract or the lease expiration or move-out date for public housing. And you would have to make a prorated payment for any amount due. In both programs, you have the option of sending that IRP either to the family or the utility company. And under this new rule, if you're paying the utility company, then you now must notify the family of the amount that's been paid. Let's move on and talk about the rule changes that apply only to the voucher program. The first one, you may already be doing this. It was authorized under the 2014 Appropriations Act, and it's the option to inspect units every 2 years instead of every year. Now, they also put in a provision for accepting alternative inspections that we're also going to talk about. On the inspection front, you could go out every 2 years, every year, or a mix of the two. And if you decide to do a mix of the two, then you need to establish some fair way of determining which landlords have their units inspected every year versus every 2 years. You might base it on their record of maintaining their units up to HQS. And as I said, HUD also authorized housing authorities to, in some cases, accept alternate inspection standards. And the reason is this. Combined financing and multiple subsidies are becoming prevalent. Many of the properties our clients live in have layered subsidies from various different government buckets of money, and each one of those may have inspectors coming in. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to subject families to multiple annual inspections, especially if the units are passing. So you don't have to do this. It's optional, but you may establish a policy for accepting alternative inspection standards. Now, if the property is a PBV property, you can go to the triennial inspections that are typically carried out by tax credit and rely on that. That's only for PBVs, not for other tax credit properties where you have clients with tenant-based vouchers. If you are going to go with an alternative inspection, of course you have to have language describing this in the admin plan. If only a sample of units are inspected, then our units have to be included in the population from which the sample is drawn. If the property fails that alternate inspection, then we have to get involved and make sure that the unit is brought up to HQS But if the property passes, then we can go with that even if there are deficiencies noted. Some inspection standards, such as UPCS, they have a system of deficiencies rather than a pass-fail, or in addition to a pass-fail. So HUD says, if you want to rely on inspections carried out by tax credit, home, or HUD, such as REAC inspections, they're good with that. But if you want to go with some other inspection protocols, such as local rental property inspections required under code, then you have to send all the information to HUD, and they will decide if they will allow you to rely on those inspections. In some cities, the local codes require a city inspection every year, and you may or may not be able to use that and skip your own inspection. It really depends on whether they're looking at the same things that we would be looking at. If the code inspection meets or exceeds HQS, then it's probably going to be approved. So there's an option for biennial inspections. There is an option for accepting certain types of alternate inspection results instead of sending out your own inspector. The next option is a little bit controversial. It's very popular, though. When this was in the proposed rule and we would teach this in update classes, sometimes people were cheering. And this is an option where HUD will now allow you to charge landlords for failed re-inspections in certain situations. And you can charge a fee, and HUD says a reasonable fee, but of course they don't define reasonable. One agency told me they were planning to institute a $25 fee. I think everyone would agree that's reasonable. Another agency said they wanted to charge $75. Is that reasonable? I don't know. HUD's not saying. Does that represent, what if $75 represents the cost of somebody going out? So this fee for a failed reinspection can only be charged in specific situations. It cannot be charged for any inspection or reinspection prior to the execution of the HAP contract, meaning prior to the initial term of the lease. So no matter how many times you go out before HAP contract execution, the owner cannot be charged. And you cannot charge for the first inspection when you go out for the annual or biennial, even if the unit fails miserably. So when could you charge that reasonable fee? Two situations. The unit failed, the owner called and said the repairs are made, and when the inspector goes out, the deficiencies have not been corrected. Or the allotted time period for repair has gone by and the deficiencies have not been corrected, regardless of whether the owner called you and said that they were done. Now, I see a potential problem with the second one. So for non-life-threatening HQS fails, the timeline is typically 30 days. If the owner doesn't call and you send the inspector out on day 31 and the repairs have not been made, I can see that potentially being a problem if you try to charge. So maybe this is something that HUD will clarify in the supplemental guidance that they have said they'll issue. Remember, this is optional. You would have to establish this policy in your admin plan. And since it's optional, you could have a different standard. You could say, Well, it's only if we go out the third time and it still fails that we charge. Some other rules with this: the owner cannot pass this fee to the family. If you collect these fees, they're added to your admin fee reserve, which, as you know, can only be used for activities related to the program. So it's not going into the, Christmas party slush fund. Now, here's some things to think about. Remember, this is optional. It doesn't have a mandatory start date. There's no big hurry. So it's a good idea to take time to plan ahead and consider how this is actually going to work. First of all, how many of these do you have? Failed reinspection. So the inspector went out, the unit failed, the owner called, said repairs were made, but they weren't. Or the time had elapsed and the repairs had not been made. Do you think this is going to come up once or twice a year? Or do you think you might have several of these a month? How are you going to collect those fees? Are you going to send the owner a bill? Are you going to require cash before the inspector will, well, no, that's not true because they already did the reinspection and saw that it failed. How are you going to collect it? Are you going to send a bill? Are you going to send one every month? How long do you give the owner to pay the fee? What if the owner refuses to pay? What are you going to do then? I'm pretty sure you cannot take it out of next month's HAP because the HAP contract terms don't include you charging the owner a fee, and that contract's legally binding on both parties. Well, you could disqualify the owner. You could put the owner on your owner ban list. But remember, those optional owner disapprovals only apply to future HAP contracts, not to people that are under HAP contract with that owner now. So in other words, we would be able to tell the owner, well, we're not going to sign up any future clients with you, but we're not going to make anybody move that's on the program now. What are you going to do? Also, think about what is the level of owner participation in your area of those owners with rental properties in lower poverty areas. Is it possible that instituting this kind of fee could make those owners less willing to participate? And at the other end of that spectrum, what if you only have a couple of owners in your jurisdiction that take the voucher at all? Would this kind of a fee possibly alienate one or more of those owners that you really need to keep on the program? Also, keep in mind, the HAP contract already includes remedies if the unit doesn't pass HQS. It's a breach of the HAP contract, and the PHA's remedies include suspension, abatement, and termination of the payment and termination of the HAP contract. Now, I know this is popular and everybody wants to penalize those landlords that aren't maintaining their units the way they should. But take some time, plan ahead, and think about how this is actually going to work if you decide to adopt such a policy. Another part of the proposed rule that made it into the final rule is if either a participant or a government official reports life-threatening conditions in the unit, then the rule says you must inspect within 24 hours of being notified. And life-threatening conditions are defined as anything for which your inspector would give the owner 24 hours to correct. And those are not defined in HQS, so they're probably defined in your administrative plan, and they're the I'm sure they're familiar to you. Things like inoperable smoke detector, no water, no heat if you're in a cold climate, door kicked off the hinges, those 24-hour fail items. That's the kind of things this applies to. Now, we don't know exactly how this is going to work in real life. For example, if the client calls at 4 p.m. on Friday. So hopefully HUD will clarify that. If a participant or a government official calls with a non-life-threatening condition, then you have up to 15 days to go out and inspect. Okay, we have two more changes for the HCV program, and one of them has to do with exception payment standards, if needed as a reasonable accommodation to permit a family with a disabled family member to rent an accessible unit. The requirement to give these exceptions has been in effect going back 6-7 years. The current notice is notice PIH 2013-18. And under the old rule, the Housing Authority could approve exceptions up to 110% of fair market rent, or FMR. They had to request field office approval for 111% through 120%. And HUD headquarters has to approve exceptions above 120%. And this was one of the temporary compliance options, was for the Housing Authority to approve exceptions in-house up to 120% of FMR. HUD found that the field office approval process was taking up too much time, and by the time it was completed, the units were no longer available. So this is not really a policy issue because the field office has been taken out of the equation. So when you need an exception payment standard as a reasonable accommodation, then the Housing Authority now approves if it's up to 120% of FMR, and you still must seek headquarters approval above that level. And HUD headquarters does approve these pretty routinely. Every quarter, they publish a Federal Register notice listing all of the regulatory waivers that were approved during a 3-month period. They just issued one this week, in fact, and a good number, well over half of the regulatory waivers for public and Indian housing were for payment standard exceptions. Now, don't get confused about this. We're not talking about the kind of exception payment standards you need if your FMRs are not high enough. We're talking about an exception for an individual family to permit that family to rent a unit with accessible features needed by a disabled family member. And I don't want to make this sound too simple, because in the PIH notice there are a whole bunch of requirements for this, documents you have to gather, determinations you have to make, etc. So for more information, see notice PIH 2013-18. The last change that applies just to the voucher program is that HUD removed the regulatory requirement to conduct an interim re-exam to add a family member. Why did they do this? They said because public housing doesn't have such a rule. And it's true they don't, but for those of you in public housing, I'm pretty sure you do an interim to add a family member. This rule doesn't say you can't do an interim. It just says you have to make the change at the next annual or interim. We're not sure how this is going to work in real life, and we have submitted an email question to HUD. Because if you're adding an adult, you have to determine eligibility before they can move into the unit, right? With the criminal background, signing of release forms, the EIV debts and terminations module, sex offender screening, all the stuff that you do. And if you're adding a child, then typically that would bring down the family rent because of the dependent allowance. And the existing interim reg says you must perform interim decreases at the family's request. Now remember, it's okay to still do an interim. And HUD just changed the regulatory language to have it align with the reg covering public housing. All right, we have a few changes to discuss that apply only to public housing, and then I'm going to open the line for questions. The first change is a change in the way we calculate prorated rent for mixed families. Mixed families means some of the family members are eligible and some are ineligible based on their citizenship or immigration status. And as you know, those families have a prorated rent calculation, so they actually pay more than they would pay if everyone in that family were eligible. In order to calculate that prorated rent, we used to use this fake made-up number called the public housing maximum rent. It was only used for proration for mixed families, and the instructions for establishing that public housing maximum rent were 8 pages long. It was an 8-page appendix in HUD's handbook on non-citizens. So does that sound complicated? You bet it was complicated, and you were supposed to update it every year. Well, now, in a very welcome change, HUD says, instead of the public housing maximum rent, we're going to use the flat rent for purposes of proration. This does not mean that all public housing residents are going on flat rent. It's just a number that we use in the calculation to assign a dollar value to the public housing subsidy for purposes of proration. I know a lot of agencies were already using the flat rent, even though the old rule specifically said not to do that. Well, guess what? Now we do that. And this is mandatory. They also fixed a problem with the old calculation, which was that the public housing maximum rent had the effect of capping mixed family rent. So the new calculation is, if the family's TTP exceeds the flat rent, then we use the TTP for proration instead of the flat rent. This is something that your software vendor may need to make changes to your program for. Unless you can already fill in the public housing maximum rent manually, in order for this calculation to come out correctly on the 50058, your software may need to be updated. So no more public housing maximum rent. That's a good thing. But don't let the fact that we're using flat rent now confuse you. It doesn't mean they're going on flat rent. It just means we're using that as a number in the calculation. Second change. HUD is now giving you the option of accepting self-certification of compliance with the community service and self-sufficiency requirement. This is optional. You could continue to require third-party verification. I'm not sure why you would. Now, of course, if you are accepting self-certification, if you decide to do that, of course, if there's something you think is questionable, of course you're supposed to investigate and look into that. Now, I thought that housing authorities would love this option, but what I'm hearing from you guys is you don't love it. I also thought agencies would love the fact that people on food stamps are now exempt from community service, and many of you do not love that either. But this is streamlining. This can make your life simpler and easier. Now, since the last community service notice came out last year, HUD now permits people who have to do community service to aggregate the hours. As long as they have 96 hours at the end of the year, they no longer have to do 8 hours in each individual month. Therefore, there is no reason under the sun for you to be checking on community service compliance any more frequently than once a year. If you decide to go with self-certification, then there's a list of things that have to be on the form. They're on slide 53. Certification that it's true, dates, hours, description of what they did, and a contact person. Also, HUD says if you accept self-certifications, you have to review a sample of them to make sure they're complete and provide sufficient information. You are not required to contact the third party listed on the form as part of this review. And you have to tell families that self-certification may be subject to review and or validation. So you're already required to give families written information about community service at intake and every year. So you could simply add one sentence to those existing materials saying your self-certification is subject to review. Okay, next to last subject. HUD made major changes to the public housing grievance procedure. The proposed rule on streamlining grievances was published back in 2008. I really had forgotten it existed. And most of those provisions were adopted in this final rule. Now, in making these changes, HUD explained that the public housing grievance rules were extremely detailed and what HUD called overly prescriptive in comparison to the voucher program rules for informal hearings, which leave many things up to PHA policy and do not result in civil rights violations. So they said, we got way too much detail in this. And the end result is a lot of former requirements have been completely deleted from the regs, but for many of them, you still have to have policies describing how you will do them. So the first change is there's no longer a requirement to consult the resident board before appointing a specific person as a hearing officer. But instead, you must insert into the public housing lease a description of how you select a hearing officer, however that may be. Your method of selection may be that the executive director appoints an employee who was not involved in the decision under appeal. Or your method may be that your agency contracts with an outside administrative law judge, or however you do it in real life, that needs to go into your public housing lease. Next change, you're no longer required to maintain a library of hearing officer decisions with the identifying information blacked out. However, you now must maintain a log of those decisions and make that log available to anybody that's interested. Of course, I think it kind of goes without saying that whatever policies you adopt must meet constitutional due process requirements and any requirements under your local, state, or federal law. Now, on slide 59, I have a list of former regulations that have been deleted now. Remember, some of these you need to cover in policy. So there's no longer a rule stating how a client must request a hearing, but clients still have to request hearings. So you have to have something in your ACOP. Do they have 10 business days, shorter, longer? Must the hearing be requested in writing? The rule that required families appealing a rent increase to make an escrow deposit of their old rent is gone. Completely abolished. That's kind of good. They took out the rule on scheduling hearings, but again, you still have to schedule hearings, so you need to have a policy covering this now. Expedited grievance procedures still exist. They were simply renumbered under another section. They took out the rule saying the hearing officer can make a decision if they've heard the identical issue for the same family. They took out the rule that specified exactly how the hearing is to be conducted, such as that the hearing officer has to control the behavior of the parties, etc. So your ACOP section on grievances is probably going to need some fairly big reworking. Now, I know you want to get your chance for Q&A, so I only have one more slide. In this final rule, HUD clarified the rule on vacant units for which they will continue to pay you an operating subsidy, and they clarified that it's 3% for each individual project. So in other words, they will only pay an op sub for 3% of units for each project. So if you have a 10% vacancy rate in one of your projects, but your overall vacancy rate is under 3%, they're still only going to give you an op sub up to the 3% cap for that development. Okay, I'm now going to oh gosh. Okay, I appear to have had my screen paused for a while. I apologize for that. But I'm now going to open the floor for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *7. If you muted your phone for me earlier, thank you. I think I have you all muted now, so you can unmute yourself. Press *7 to raise your hand, and I will unmute you and take your question. Now, since we have a very large group today, I'm going to ask you to limit yourself to no more than 1 or 2 questions, 2 at the most, so that other people can get their chance to... Okay, somebody's unmuted already. My first call is from New Hampshire in the 603. Go ahead, New Hampshire. Yes. Yes, same way you do now for a resident or participant family or an ineligible non-citizen. You assign an alt ID. You're welcome. My next caller is in Connecticut in the 203. Cannot do that. Yes. We cannot pass the cost of program operation along to the low-income clients. There's a notice out that specifically deals with application fees, but it also covers all like fees. Now, you have an option to send a notice of termination for missed appointments, but we do not have the option to charge a fee for any of our services. Appointments, voucher extensions. We've had agencies that were charging for a lot of different things like that. It's a low-income assistance program. We can't charge a fee for our services. Okay, my next caller is in Virginia in the 757 area code. Are you there? Hi. No, it's for anybody that qualifies for the EID on or after May 9th, regardless of how long they've been on the program. Yes. Well, no, the new rules have to apply to anybody that qualifies on or after May 9th. And you don't need board approval for the 2-year time limitation, but you do for the percentage that you're going to exclude. So maybe you should see if you could get like provisional approval or something like that if you plan to go to more than 50%, because then you don't want to have yet a third effective date, if you change that percentage later on down the line. Yeah, you're welcome. Just trying to figure out how that could be a little less painful. Okay, my next caller is in Florida in the 305. That is exactly the same. There's no change in that. The Streamline does not, you do not skip a re-exam. The only thing that's streamlined is the verification process of fixed income. You're still doing a full re-exam every year and recalculating the rent. You're welcome. Okay, my next caller is in Vermont in the 802. Yes, I can. Well, we're anticipating within a month. They're in the process now. We started, the first day they came out, and they're going through the revision process right now. That's right. But in real life, this is the same as the rule we've had for people that are already on the program that are adding a child, for example, when they have a baby. So how many families have you actually had to terminate under that rule? No, no, this only applies to people coming on the program. You don't really need the social for a newborn while they're on the wait list, right? No, no. You're welcome. Okay, my next caller is in Tennessee in the 865 area code. I can. That's an interesting question. So I would say it would be 3 years from whenever you last verified it. The notice doesn't go to that level of detail, but I think you would be safe with that because the final rule says at admission and every 3 years thereafter. So if you just started in 2014, then you probably haven't, I would say you have not hit the 3 years yet. Okay, they are calling it Streamlined Annual, but it's only streamlining the verification of fixed income. You still do the full re-exam. You just can apply a COLA to the fixed income source instead of needing third-party documentation every year. Well, some agencies do annual re-exams by mail, but that of course includes getting an updated 9886 and all the other activities. You're welcome. Okay, my next caller is in Pittsburgh in the 412. Yeah, so do we. I'm sorry, go ahead. The notice does not go to that depth of detail, so I don't know. If it was me, I'd say sure, but the notice doesn't say. So you might want to send that inquiry to your field office. And we hope that HUD will clarify how this works if the client does call on Friday afternoon at 4 to report a life-threatening condition. Yeah. Oh wait, you're not in Pittsburgh? Oh, okay, go ahead, yeah. We cannot at this point. Congress passed a separate law authorizing triennial re-exams for families on fixed incomes. But that just happened, and HUD has to publish rules on it. That is not in effect yet. You're welcome. Okay, next caller in Iowa in the 712. Hi, Michelle. Yes, if they need it to disclose and document. And remember, we can no longer require that they provide only the card. We have to take any other document issued by the Social Security Administration or other government agency like welfare or unemployment that shows their social. That changed in 2010. And it's in the current regulations at CFR 5.216. And the reason HUD changed that is because now all socials are verified through EIV. So if there's any problem with the number, you're going to know in a short time. No, I think that's reasonable. There's nothing in the rule that says it gives you 15 days, so that's some time to play around with. And we always required them, and it's reasonable. Of course, they have to let the landlord know and give the landlord a reasonable amount of time when it's a non-life-threatening condition. You're welcome. Yeah, that has not changed. Okay, by the way, I've been in Iowa recently. I had a great time. My next caller is in Georgia in the 229. Yes, that's in the latest community service notice. It's notice PIH 2015-12. That's right. That's good news, isn't it? That's what I think too. But some of our customers don't like it. I don't know why. They feel like they don't deserve to be exempt or something. Did you have another question? You're welcome. All right, my next caller is in New York in the 212. Oh, you're welcome. All righty. My next caller is in, it looks like Santa Barbara in the 805. Oh, hi, Gabrielle. No. But we have emailed an inquiry to HUD because there's a couple of things we don't understand about the new calculation, including flat rent. So if you want to email me after the session, I can give you any information we do have. But I got to tell you, we don't know when PIC will really. Well, that's a question we asked them. So if you could, was that from headquarters, Gabrielle? Okay, yeah, my email's Annie, ANNIE, @nanmckay.com. And I can show you what we sent to HUD on that. I'm not sure I understand. First of all, if you're hanging on in Washington, hang on, I am going to call on you. Gabrielle, the Housing Authority is going to have to apply the COLA and update the income. Are you trying to think of a way for that to happen automatically? Yeah, you got me there. I don't know, because they could be under, it could be listed under a lot of different codes. Well, several. All right. Okay, great, thank you. And my last call from Washington in the 509. Uh-huh. I don't believe the notice says. So under asset management, isn't an AMP a project? Isn't that the P in AMP? Yes, I know. And don't they consider an AMP a project now? Yeah, I do too. But you might want to double check with the field office just to make sure. If it's okay with Gabrielle, it's fine with me. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, and thank everyone for attending. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the week, and I hope I'll be talking to you soon.